The phrase begging the question has a curious sort of origin, and many of us simply use this phrase to mean raising the question. So you read something and you kind of find the argument fascinating, but you have some questions about it, and you say, well, this begs the question for me. But that's a very loose use of this particular phrase, and some people would say it's even incorrect. Although, of course, if enough people use it incorrectly, then in some ways other people might say, well, it is correct because the majority rules. So let's see where this phrase then actually comes from and what the proper use of it is, according to the sticklers. And the proper use goes back to Latin, and it goes also back to philosophy. So in philosophy, we have this particular fallacy. A fallacy is a mistake in reasoning, and we'll talk about what kind of fallacy this is in a moment. But the fallacy in Latin is called petitio principii. So petitio, this comes from the verb peto, which used to mean to seek or to request. And then in later Latin, it had also to do with assuming something. So assuming. And the second part, you can probably kind of tell what it relates to. It relates to the word principle, or you might say premise, or your starting argument. Let's just translate it as your starting principles in this case. Now, this last little bit here, this is the genitive case, so it means of. In Latin, they can kind of indicate from the ending of the noun how it functions. And so what we're really saying here is that we are assuming, assuming our starting principles. You might say an assumption of starting principles. What does that mean? Well, it has to do with a kind of circular argument. So you kind of go in circles and you argue that something is the case, but you have based your argument on your starting assumptions. And that's really what begging the question means. Begging the question refers to an argument that has already assumed one of its premises to be true, and then it simply repeats that premise as part of its conclusion. So let's look at an example to see what this actually means. In this example we read, he said that drinking more wine will raise your spirits, a good pun, because wine makes people happy. His argument simply begs the question. So this would be a correct use of the phrase. Now, what you see here is that we've actually used a couple of synonyms in our argument. So raising your spirits, right, that is a kind of happiness. And then at the end, it says wine makes people happy. So in a sense, our premise is over here, right? Wine will make you happy. And then we've simply assumed that our starting principles are true, and we repeat it in a sense in our conclusion. So we say, because wine makes you happy, wine makes you happy. And you can see the kind of circular reasoning here. That's the basic principle of petitio principii, or begging the question. And there are lots of variations of kind of doing the circular reasoning, and I'll give you one more example in a second, but as long as you kind of understand what it's referring to, then you can use the phrase begging the question correctly. Now, we call this an informal fallacy, so not a formal fallacy. And in logic, a formal fallacy actually implies a mistake. It implies that the statement is probably not true. But an informal fallacy is a fallacy where the argument might make sense ultimately. Okay, it's just the way we got to the conclusion is kind of problematic, and it assumes a little bit too much here. So the last example then, I guess we should insert something here. They want less bureaucracy and political involvement in the economy. After all, they say big government is bad for business. However, this question-begging argument only proves what it assumes. So we've just rephrased it a little bit here to put it in a different kind of, phrase. A little bit awkward perhaps, but you can see how you can incorporate this. And again, we have this kind of circular argument. And what I really want to emphasize is the way often we create these arguments by simply using synonyms or different language for the same thing. So if we say they want less bureaucracy and political involvement in the economy, then this concept of less involvement is simply repeated in the actual argument. after all. There's our because kind of statement. So watch out for that. Because they say big government, well, that's basically bureaucracy, right? Political involvement is bad for business. But business is simply restating economy. And you can see then that this kind of argument, this begging the question, is very, very common. So you should actually have lots of opportunity for using this phrase. But then we get back to our initial question, which is, which use are you going to employ? Are you going to simply say begging the question as in, well, it raises a question? And some people might frown at that because it's simply a popular kind of misuse of the original phrase. Or are you going to be a stickler and insist that we should only use begging the question for these logical fallacies and, that's all it's meant for? I'll leave it up to you, but at least now you know what your choices are.